recording. Well, welcome to our October Happy Melly seminar with the fabulous, is it Peter or Petar?
Petar.
It's Petar, right. That's the spelling. Sorry, I've been calling you Peter. The fabulous Petar. So you've been on our podcast already, our Happy Melly podcast, which has been super insightful. So I'm just going to moderate this. I mean, Roger, right now you're the only one on the chat. More people might join, but our community does watch these. But I'm going to not ask as many questions because I've already had a chance to have a great conversation with Petar. So I think maybe Petar, maybe just give us an intro into you, what Gap Jumpers is, the whole philosophy, and then, it's really chill, so you can ask questions or however you want to do it.
Okay, excellent. So let me just give a brief introduction about Gap Jumpers. We are a company that builds technology to help companies make objective decisions, particularly around things that can make a company more effective or not. And right now we are looking at the most important decision that a company needs to make in an effective and objective way, which is whom do I hire, whom do I not hire? And we've built a platform that allows companies to mitigate any potential unconscious bias so that they are actually making that decision in a more structured, objective manner that actually suits them and levels the playing field for applicants. Because a lot of times, as we know, a lot of decisions that we make don't really always correlate with the criteria that we should be using. And this is why some groups are, disadvantaged. And this has been our first product. But in essence, we're a company that focuses on organizational effectiveness and better decision making, and we thought let's start with the hiring process first, because that's usually the process where a lot of faulty decisions, unfortunately, are being made. That's it.
The best sum up elevator pitch. Roger, do you want to ask questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So you talk about unconscious bias. Can you talk about like some common points during the hiring process that it's useful to be aware of unconscious bias?
Yes. So the easiest way to break it down is to if you could do the following. If you can imagine a horizontal line that is the hiring process from start to finish. And usually a hiring process is broken up into several steps. The most common ones are initial resume screening, then there is a recruitment conversation, then there is a hiring manager or a technical conversation, then there is the offer stage. That is usually a somewhat standard flow of hiring decisions. And what we see is that the most obvious place where the bias takes place is at the resume part. So when a resume gets screened, and at the technical part, which is where the hiring manager has an interview either through the phone or in person with a talent applicant. And then the reasons for that are, again, quite obvious. Let me start with why there is a lot of bias when it comes to the hiring manager interviews. It's that the hiring managers are not really trained to do interviews. It is if you will, a side gig for them. Every once in a while, depending on the size of the company, hiring manager is asked by recruitment specialists or in HR or someone else, hey, you need to hire more people. Why don't you conduct interviews? And as such, it's not something that they excel at, and they oftentimes fall back on habits that they formed through years of interviewing, or just pure instinct, and they go with their gut feeling. And yes, of course, a lot of times they get trained. However, I always draw the comparison to, it's like me telling Roger, hey, I'm going to give you a course in Mandarin for 2 hours on a Monday afternoon. And then 6 months down the line, you're going to be put in a situation. I'm going to drop you somewhere in China, and you're expected to, remember what you were taught in those 2 hours of Mandarin. That's usually why, how it is with a lot of hiring managers, because it's not something that they do every day. They will get a course every once in a while, but then on the moment that you need to recall these, learnings and access them, oftentimes it's not there. And as such, there is a lot of, okay, where did you study, where did you work type of questions, or, do I know somebody who knows you? So that way I have some kind of social proof as to how good or bad you are. And then, I'll just make a general assumption whether or not I think you're a culture fit, which usually means, are you, do I like you as a person in my team? And then, so that's where we see a lot of bias. And on the other hand, like I said, the first step, the resume screening, is a lot of bias. Of course, that's an obvious one because I upload my resume, and in the resume, you can deduce, I would say 90% of the things about me. You can, guess my gender. You can guess my ethnicity. You can guess my socioeconomic background, most likely based on where I went to school, both high school or public school, as they say in the UK, and my university background. You can pretty much paint a picture of who I am, and most probably, you would not be wrong, right? If somebody's called Roger Johnson, then if you ask 100 people, they would probably say, well, probably it's a Caucasian person. And most likely, probabilistically speaking, you'd not be wrong. Yes, there might be a African American Roger Johnson, or there might be an Asian Roger Johnson, but in general, people tend to make these deductions pretty accurately. And when you couple that with the fact that a resume is being screened by a machine sometimes, so it has keywords that it looks for, or by a recruiter who spends anywhere from 2 to 15 seconds with a resume, snap decisions are being made. And as such, if your profile on paper doesn't match that snap decision, whether it's through the machine or through the recruiter's eyes, then you probably get screened out for a lot of things. Again, I'll give you simple example. In the US, there's something called the Ivy League schools, and in the UK, there is something called the Russell 20 group schools, which is the elite university educational institutes in both countries. And there's oftentimes perceptions, if you went to one of these schools, then you'll probably be good, though it's just a proxy for the fact that you were able to actually, get into that school. It doesn't say how well you did, or comparatively speaking, if somebody went to a lower school from a more difficult background, maybe they're smarter. But again, it's a snap decision. So we see that a lot of snap decisions are made at the front end and at the almost final end where the managers are interviewing, and that's where we try and intervene and just make sure that those snap decisions don't cost the company great talent because they thought, okay, this particular person doesn't fit our perception of what talent looks like, and on the other hand, doesn't also negatively impact the chances of anybody else actually getting a job if they don't fit that profile. Now, that was a long story long. And I quite honestly, I think I was rambling. I don't even know if I answered your question, Roger. So, if feel free to jump in and, and dive into more.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. That was a good start. Kind of like a big overview. So I'm wondering at the resume part. I mean, I've heard about some organizations that will do things like anonymizing the person's name and background on the resume, so that you have no idea about any of their demographics. So do you do that? Do you recommend that? And then if you do, at what point do you actually find out who is this person? Is that when they've passed the screening and you actually talk to them or meet them for the first time?
So that's a very interesting question. And let me break it down into two things. One is the question about, do I endorse resume screening? And I'll be upfront and say I am biased here because I don't. I do endorse the fact that you should try it as an organization, but I don't endorse it myself. And it's luckily for me, it's not just me saying it. There's been some studies that have come out that actually show that anonymizing a resume can have negative adverse impact unintendedly. In Australia, for instance, they were trying to get more women in public service organizations, so governmental organizations, and they found actually that actually decreased. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll jump into that. But let me first talk about why I don't endorse resume screening. As you mentioned, companies will sometimes remove my name and remove perhaps where I studied. So you could say, well, you know what, that at least eliminates potentially knowing my ethnicity and my gender. However, it's quite a slippery slope, right? Because what if under languages, a lot of applicants will put down the languages that they are fluent in, right? So they'll put down, maybe I speak Russian, I speak Punjabi, I speak English, I speak French. All of a sudden, you can still start to make deductions about who I potentially am. Then there is extracurricular activities. There's a really interesting study that was done in the US that showed that if men that had polo, as in the horse riding sport, on their resume as extracurricular activities, they were perceived to be really, really, really qualified, particularly for service industries such as lawyers and consultants. Because again, there is this implicit assumption that hey, if you were part of a polo club, then you must be a polished individual. Contrarily, for women, that wasn't the case. If a woman was part of the polo club, people didn't perceive her to be any more suitable to be a lawyer than somebody who didn't go to a polo club. The point being here is that if you want to do the redaction of a resume properly, you end up with one of those documents that sometimes there is a press conference right on television, and it's somebody from the CIA that will give a press conference, and then they'll say, in support of my talk here, we're going to release some documents for general consumption for the public. And basically what you have is a document that has been completely redacted, and there's just a date there, because everything else is deemed to be national security information. And that's kind of the same thing with resume screening. If you really want to do it properly, then you need to start looking at, okay, what else do I need to remove? Yes, the name is important. Where they studied is important. Well, what about extracurricular activities? What about languages? What about additional information that an applicant might be proud of? Sometimes people will say, you know what, I was the recipient of a scholarship. I won a scholarship. Now, let's be honest here, most of the time, if you are from a well-to-do family, you probably not win scholarships, right? Because your parents are in a position to actually afford the tuition. Again, so there's all these markers that are on a resume that can still give, and we're talking about snap decisions here, right? This is you might not even glance over it consciously, but you might still, process the information. So that's why we say, what, if you want to do resume redacting, go ahead, try it, see if it works, but beware of the fact that, you might still be missing some of the things that are able to cause a unconscious negative decision towards that particular applicant, or even not if it's negative, but favor somebody else. Now, what we actually endorse is, and this might not come as a surprise, is what we do, right? Because it solves two, what's the saying? Two birds, one stone? Yes, it kills two birds with one stone. So the original, like the genesis of anonymization of hiring, finds its roots in a famous orchestra studies in the 1950s and 60s. Orchestras, musical orchestras in the U.S. were pretty much all male dominated, and they wanted to actually increase the parity of that. They want to have more women actually play instruments in orchestras, and that's where they first started experimenting with anonymized assessment of applicants. So they put up a screen, and then they made people walk up to that screen and they play their instrument. It didn't work at first. Just a little side note here, because the judges could still hear clicking of heels, so they could still make out, oh, this is a woman or this is a man, just based on their steps. Again, this is kind of a parallel with a resume, right? I mean, there's all these little anonymized, little elements that can still give you a hint as to what that person is. So they put it on a carpet. People walked up to that carpet. There was no more sound of shoes. And as we see now over decades, there is almost parity, right? There's almost 50% gender parity in orchestras. Now, that particular study has two elements to it. One is anonymization. In other words, you stand in front of a screen. And secondly, it's about showcasing your skills. And when we jump from the stage to the boardroom, the key question that managers want to have answered is, can you do the work I need? Because most managers that we interview and we regularly poll them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I actively oppose diversity, 10 being it's all I think about, most managers are a 5 and a 6. Like they say, you know what, I'm not really against it, I'm not really for it. As long as somebody can actually do the work, I'll hire whoever. So instead of having anonymization of resumes, which makes the impact of whom you get in front of you double, right? Because right now I don't have any information on the resume, I don't know anything about you, I know even less now because it's redacted. So all of a sudden I'm confronted with, let's say, a person who totally is not what I think talent should be looking like. That's one of the reasons why sometimes resume anonymization has that negative adverse impact, because you're redacting certain elements, but you're not creating any, let me use a funny word here, it's not a safe, there's not a safe area for the manager, right? Because I don't have any proof, I'm going into an unknown here, there's a redacted resume and I just have to talk to this particular person. With skills assessments, at least you cover one basic question for the manager, right? Can this person do the work? So that's where you can actually assess the skills, and that lowers the defenses of a of a manager slightly, because their anxiety levels drop, their some of the fears and reservations that they have as to who is this person in front of me, I don't know anything about them, are somewhat mitigated by the fact that they know one thing, and it just happens to be the most important thing for a manager. Whomever I'm speaking to, at least I know one thing: this person has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they actually have the working skills that I'm looking for. So in that sense, I kind of relax. I go into that conversation knowing one thing, right? You can do the job. Now everything else we can kind of figure out, and that's the big thing that we kind of advocate to all companies of all sizes, right? It doesn't matter if you're a startup with 10 people or you're a large enterprise. Always try and figure out how you can give somebody a taste of the real types of problems that they will be facing, and then just let them solve them, because that is always going to be a somewhat better indicator of how well somebody will function within your team, as opposed to send me in a resume or let me then ask you all these questions. That it's not a fair reflection of somebody, right? I might just be nervous, I might have a speech impediment, God knows what, like there's all these factors that may not make me the best interviewer, but that doesn't mean that I am not going to be a really good person for that particular job. So we always say, what, try and assess people on by giving them a sample of the work they need to do, let them solve it, and then and then just look for markers in their past, right? Talk to people that have worked with them. Again, that's a very good way of figuring out if somebody is a person, if their personality is not out of sync. And again, don't try and fit them into weird cultural idiosync, I don't even know what the word is, like weird things, right? Some people say, we like to go out on a Friday and have a beer. Well, that's not really a culture fit. That's just you wanting to hang out. If you look for cultural things that are important, you could say, are you conscientious? Are you able to deliver work on time? Do you show up when needed? Do you like those are universal elements of cultural fit that can be tested through valid and reliable ways, that don't have anything to do with your personal subjective things of what a good teammate should be looking like. So again, we break it down into a very simple formula: competence plus conscientiousness equals a good hire. You look for competence, look for conscientiousness, and if a person scores relatively high on those two elements, you'll probably not have a bad hire. Will you hire the next Steve Jobs? Probably not, but then most companies wouldn't recognize the next Steve Jobs, because when he was at Atari, he got fired. So, don't break your head over whether or not you're missing the next Steve Jobs. Just try and figure out if you're going to get good, competent, decent people into your company, and that can be assessed really quickly. Conscientiousness tests, they can get them online for free. The Big Five is a really good test that has been validated and is very reliable. and then look for competency assessments. Give them a taste. Ideally, if somebody works in your particular city, you could say, you know what, come to my office for a day or half a day. I'll hire you as a freelancer for a week. Again, it's an investment that in the long run will pay off, right? You might have to pay somebody, I don't know, let's say £500 or $500 for 2 days of work, but you actually put them through the ringer in a real life scenario. And that is a much better way of assessing whether somebody is going to be a good teammate or not than any of these proxies.
No, Petar, I just want to this is fabulous stuff. I just want to make sure if Jane or Marian have any questions as well. Marian, welcome to the chat. No, do you guys have anything you want to ask? Don't be shy to jump in.
I won't be. I'm sorry I was late. I was caught up with my dog.
No problem. Jane, did you?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Please.
This is really good meeting. I didn't at all realize what this subject was going to be about when I saw the title, so I'm glad I made it. I will have to leave a little early just because my business is going to be closing and I don't want to be locked in. But I wanted to ask, when you're talking about the competency type testing, I notice as I'm a prior government employee that in the last number of years, a lot of the applications go very in depth to asking specific questions about, have you done this? To what level have you done this? And I think they do a pretty good job of eliminating people by asking those very specific questions. But I was wondering, now that I'm in the private industry, if companies can find some packages or something that can help them to build that kind of questioning, especially if they're not going to invest in the 500 pounds or whatever for somebody to come in a half day. I culturally here, I just know that wouldn't work, but they probably could benefit from getting some kind of a kit or some kind of guidance to creating competency questions.
So the very simple answer is when what you would want to do is create a future-focused competency assessment. And it sounds a lot more complex than it is. Basically, what you want to do is not ask somebody at the outset what they've done or how they have done it or to what level of proficiency they've done it, because the cost of being honest, if I can call it that, is not high at the outset, right? I'm just being interviewed here. I might kind of, sneak my way through, and if I laugh and charm, and then, you might still have a very good, feeling about me and say, well, it might not be the best hire, but I got a good feeling about this person. So what you want to do is you want to actually put the applicant in a situation where they actually have to prove it. Now, let's take, for example, you might be looking for a social media manager, right? And it doesn't have to be very complicated, but you can ask somebody, look, we work in this particular industry, and we would like to see how you would deal with a troll on Twitter that all of a sudden starts attacking our brand. Write up in maybe in you could have a day to think about it. You don't have to spend a day on it, but just write up a plan as to how you would deal with this, and show it to us. All of a sudden, you don't put the onus on asking him, have you in the past dealt with trolls? How would you have dealt with that? Because you first want to establish what they can do without you having to interview them. And then once you have that, and somebody at your company, the social media manager, would probably be in a good position to say, oh, this looks like a good answer, or this doesn't look like a good answer. I would have done it differently. And then you can call people in based on that initial assessment, right? And then you can say, look, you've done X, Y, and Z. Let's drill down on that particular answer and see if it was just luck or there was more thinking behind it. And once you're satisfied that somebody can do the work for you that you need them to do, Then as a consistency marker, you can say, okay, let's now look back in your past. What have you done that's similar? And then you can start to create a more rounded profile of somebody, right? Because it's not just about looking back in the past, but you've also had something that is more relevant to your organization. Because being a social media manager in company X is going to be different from social media manager in company Y, because the context is always going to be different. So I would advise you always, and there is a research out there that proves it, was like academic research that says that, you know, work samples, future focused work samples, are a very reliable marker of how well somebody would do, right? Because it doesn't, again, you know, we always say it can also be a red flag, right? If somebody refuses, saying, well, why would I take this particular test, right? I've got 10 years of social media manager experience, you know, I was doing it before Twitter existed, right? So to speak. Then you might say, okay, you know what, is this the type of person that we would want in our company, right? Is this the type of person that has the right attitude? If you're that good, then, you know, you wouldn't have to have any objections to it. Again, you know, you're just looking for these, I would say, markers of you know, consistent behavior that shows that they are, you know, competent and conscientious, that allow you to have, you know, a better assessment of this person. And starting with questions is always a little bit more tricky because you don't have a baseline, right? I don't know when you're lying or when you're not lying, but having you actually do something gives me a baseline, because you've actually done something and I can tell it's either good, mediocre, or poor. And then I can then, you know, assess your answers on the back end from your past a little bit better, because I have a baseline. It's almost like a polygraph test, you know, like a lie detector test. I ask you what's your name, where you're from, if the sky is blue or red, and I have a baseline. And then you can move into asking more, you know, questions that are a bit probing. So I would say flip it around, use the questionnaires. It's always a good thing, because it just, again, it's about consistency, but have them dive into the deep end first, right? Show me that you can do it, and then we'll talk.
I wonder what the I've been rummaging around your website and the jobs posted.
Yes. Awesome.
Exposure for information. You're asking people to complete a challenge, to spend considerable effort, and they're not talking about their own company. So why in heaven's name would I even consider spending that effort?
So, okay, there's two questions in there, and they're both valid, right? One is when it runs through our platform, and one is why in heaven's name would I in general do, you know, be asked and you know, to take an assessment from a company. Let me answer the first question.
I have even talked with them, because yes, I'm quite used to being tested and having assessments and things like that. But doing that up front, I would say no. Because what investment have you made in me?
Absolutely. And again, it's a very valid question, and one that we get asked as well by applicants. And just to give you, you know, full disclosure, what you see on our platform is part of the process, right? Because applicants that apply to these companies and who are assessed, once they go through the company application process, are informed of the types of assessment that are waiting for them. They are given the context and as to why these anonymized skills assessments are being given and being conducted at this particular stage. So we do wholeheartedly agree with you. Transparency is important. Giving people context is important. And ultimately, you know, giving people a choice. Like you said, you know, you might say no. Somebody else might say yes. So it just, that's, you know,
it depends
specifically
on the company, basically.
Again, it depends on the company. You're absolutely right. It also depends on the level of the type of role that we're looking for. And what we oftentimes see is that companies are very aware of the fact that they are asking the applicants to invest some time with them.
Hmm?
And as such, you know, specifically what we have as a guiding principle within our company is that as an applicant, you either get hired or you get better. meaning it's a two-way exchange. I, as an applicant, are asked to, showcase that I have these particular skills upfront as the first point of contact. And the exchange there is that, on the other hand, I, as an applicant, get two things. Now, you can argue whether that it's enough or not, and that's a different and valid conversation, but an applicant gets two things. One is they get the security of not being initially screened based on their name, where they studied, or who or what they know, which is a hugely valuable thing for applicants, particularly people that are just starting out or that are coming back. Any person that has a gap in their working history will say, you know what, this is a valid exchange. Now, secondly, what happens is every applicant also gets feedback. So I'm asking you to showcase what kind of skills you have, and then you'll be assessed. And if you don't make it through, your identity stays anonymous. So it means that the company doesn't know if Roger failed the test. Roger will still be just person X. And Roger will get feedback. Roger will actually get a breakdown saying, look, your particular answer on these particular deliverables was missing certain elements. So then Roger can understand, Roger can learn. And then Roger can actually decide, you know what, I might go back and retry the later stage. Now, this is for us a general principle, right? We feel that there is a trade-off. I'm asking you to do a little bit of work, but the trade-off is that it's being done through a process that actually enhances your probability of getting through, because most people will not have studied at an elite educational institute. Most people will not have a very good name in terms of their internship on their resume, maybe not have even worked in industries that they want to apply to. So how do you then have that catch-22, right? I mean, a very good example that we worked with, this is in the US, is military people. They've spent 5, 6, 8 years doing all kinds of things, but how do you put them on a resume that it actually translates, right? I was a manager, but now you're asking me, what's your experience doing X, Y, and Z? It doesn't mean that you cannot do it. In fact, one could argue if you can, manage in a environment that is actually life and death, you probably be very well equipped to, manage a job in a bank. But again, on paper, it doesn't translate. So yes, there are trade-offs there. We're not the end all and be all, right? A company has to engage, has to explain, has to showcase their values, has to have a clear argumentation as to why an applicant should in general want to be part of that particular company. That is all true, and that is what companies need to do. That is a larger conversation that we feel a company needs to be very specific and precise in. However, when it comes to assessments, when it comes to actually figuring out, because again, I'm asking you as an applicant, right? Can you do the work? And we know, all of us know, that a lot of applicants will put on their resume that they are proficient in French, where they might have had it 2 years in, when they were 16. So again, as applicants, we don't feel like we always have to give 100% of ourselves. Now, in order for you to be considered a really good, competent employee, at some point you have to work. And it saves everybody time and effort if it's done at the earliest point possible. However, like I said in the beginning, either get hired or you get good.
I'm not agreeing on the fact that it saves everybody time, because it only saves everybody time on the employer's side. One of the things, I've been going through the site and just a bit of feedback. What you told me just now about the benefits and the fact that applicants receive feedback, make that much more clear on your side, because it isn't. And I've just been checking the pages for applicants, and that feedback actually is what would drive me to possibly do it, even if initially I might say, well, I don't really know whether this company merits doing the work, but knowing that you'll get feedback would be added motivation, so to speak, and it's absent on your side. That's all.
Perfect. Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, I don't know about what's on the site, but I agree with Marjan that when you talked about feedback, I just jumped up and said, wow, that's a new concept from all of my experience in years of job applications is actually getting feedback. It's extremely rare. I will say one thing, and it's somewhat of a question though.
Please.
I've heard a lot of people complain, at least in France, as you feel being used to ask or answer a lot of questions that are in depth, that are the type where you have to actually resolve a problem or issue or project. And you kind of feel that that's a way that companies are gleaning information and getting some work without really even paying the person, and they do it enough where they get the information that they maybe need. Now, maybe going through a site like yours helps eliminate companies that would be doing that. But what's your opinion about that? And do you see companies doing that?
We see companies trying to do that, and we put a stop to it. It's there's a clear distinction between harvesting somebody's best ideas and seeing if they are good enough to merit further investigation for this particular job. That is something that we are very vigilant about. And I think it's one of the reasons why, applicants sometimes are hesitant to do assessments, right? Because everybody has heard the story of somebody, doing a lot of work and then not being either selected, and then, that idea may or may not end up somewhere else being used. However, as a third party, I'm gonna share a slightly unpopular, perhaps even, contrarian and controversial opinion. Most likely your idea is not $1 million idea as an applicant. Most likely it's a good idea. It's good enough to showcase that you understand the material. And if you feel it's $1 million idea, then go and execute it. And again, this is not to be, harsh on applicants. However, we've come across a lot of applicants saying, you know what, but they might get my best idea. Is it really? Well, if it's your only idea that you have, then please, keep it to yourself. Again, there is a clear definition that, that we use internally as to, what is an assessment and what is a harvesting of ideas. And then usually you can have also a legal document that will state that, right? I mean, on a job description, it says you need to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So that's what we assess for, right? We assess for X, Y, and Z. We don't assess for anything extra because apparently that extra is not really critical, right? So for us, there is a clear line that can be drawn. We assess what the hiring manager has put in the actual job description that is needed for the job, and nothing more and nothing less. Now, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek when I say, it's probably not $1 million idea, and if it's your only idea, then you should be more worried about the fact that you only have one good idea. But it is something that, we try and convey to these applicants, saying, look, at any point, if you feel like, you have something that's really good, you can actually, tell it to us, saying, look, I think I've gone above and beyond, and this is really good. And then, there have been cases where we've become an intermediary, where we've sat down with the company and said, look, this applicant feels like she has a really great idea, and would you, consider that in a environment that is covered by non-disclosure agreements or somewhat protected, right? But most of the time, the assessments are not there to harvest the best ideas. The assessments are actually there to help the company get the best person in their company, because that's what's going to make that company great, right? You want to have a person that can consistently do good work. You don't want to be known as the company that steals ideas. So while it's again, this is an interesting thing because it points to a wider thing, right? It's about confirmation bias. If I believe up front, that a company's out there to steal ideas, if that's the movie that's playing in my head, then whatever else somebody else might say is probably not gonna register, right? Because I have a preconceived notion about that. If I, as an applicant, have a different perception of what this assessment does through explanation and through understanding from the company and the communication, I will say, what, it is in all probability worth the risk. It's not, the company's not asking me to do 2 weeks of unpaid work. It's asking me to spend anywhere from 2 to 4 hours over a 48-hour period of time to come up with with the solution to an answer. If all the other things are there, like I like the company, I think it's a great mission, then I, as an applicant, will need to decide, do I want to invest the time there or not? So again, it's about how do you view that particular element. And that's why, we also give applicants a choice of, opting out and saying, hey, if you don't want to do it, then that's perfectly fine. You don't have to do it. Nobody's forcing you to give your ideas. So sometimes, you have people who say, this is not for me, and then you have to respect that.
I have one last question,
Yeah,
and this is just because, oh, go ahead.
No, I wanted to just say, we have like a couple minutes left, so Jane does.
I have more time if you guys have more time, so my schedule is okay.
It's an hour, isn't it?
I actually don't, but even if I get to see it later, I'd love to just answer this question. I just recently did a webinar through an MBA exchange platform that I'm a part of because of my studies. Mm-hmm. And it was on case interviews. And yes, I'm older and I haven't been in the consulting business before now, so I never really heard about doing case interviews and how much they're used. And in particular, I understand in that industry. But one of the things that was mentioned is that it's also being used in a lot of other industries for different types of jobs. So would you recommend preparing for case interviews to do the kinds of assessments that you all do?
So case interviews in consultancies have a very specific structure to them. In fact, there is an entire industry out there that actually prepares, graduates, for the McKinsey process. So what I think is it's twofold. One, I think it's good to go through that because it just gives you a certain way of framing and thinking through a particular problem. However, if you are applying for a role in, let's say, marketing, or you're applying for a role in engineering, or maybe even in the, in the service industry or in medicine, I wouldn't spend too much time on the actual, consultancy case studies. I would say, what will help you a lot more is to maybe spend a day shadowing somebody to just understand what they actually do in a day-to-day life, in their work environment. Because again, you're trying to get a job in a specific context, and the best way that you can actually understand what is required in that context is to immerse yourself in the context to the extent that it's possible. So the McKinsey MBA case cracking studies, I definitely recommend them because again, there is a particular way of, just taking information, understanding what am I missing, how do I ask, they have the decision trees, all that stuff is really good to have, in general for your, problem solving. But if you are looking for a specific job, then, be specific and focus on that particular industry. Try to find out what is required, have informational interviews, discover what is needed, and then try and apply that McKinsey framework to those particular type of industries. So it's about a cross-pollination of things, but I wouldn't just focus on that because the structure of the interview or the assessment might be totally different in company X, and it doesn't have anything to do with McKinsey or the consultancy, structure. So in that sense, you might, all of a sudden be caught off guard. It's good to have, but stay, keep your eyes on the prize, which is, getting a job at that particular company in that particular context.
Okay, thanks. Have fun for the rest of it. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.
Thanks.
If Roger doesn't have any questions, I've got plenty.
I've lined up a couple here.
Okay, should we do another 15 minutes? How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. Good.
Fine with me. So how about we go 1-1-1? I'll ask a question and then I'll hand over. So in the interview process, so given that the hiring manager will not actually be working alongside the person getting interviewed if they get hired, what are your thoughts on actually having the team that the person would work alongside or with being part of the interview process? And if you do think it's a good idea, how do you then manage that in terms of time commitment from everyone? Because that's quite a bit of time.
First of all, I do think it's a good idea because, again, you're trying to figure out if somebody can fit in within a particular team that they're going to spend 40 to 60 hours with. Now, in terms of logistics, what we advise people is to just break up the task of assessing whether somebody's going to be a good fit into smaller tasks. So, again, one team member might come up with the assessment question. Another team member might actually, create the criteria as to what is good and what is bad. So there is a collaborative effort on the front end. Then the hiring manager might say, you know what, I'm going to have a panel, which is me and two other, people. If the team is, let's say, 5 or 6 people, I'm just going to have me and 2 other people be there and then have the interviews. You can also use recording tools, right? I mean, you can ask an applicant, is it okay for us to record this particular interview? And then, somebody else can listen to it and then say, okay, you know what, I've made up my own, thoughts as well. But in general, what we say is, give everybody involved a subset of the task that again, how do you eat an elephant? Bit by bit. So you want to give everybody, a handful of things to do so that collectively as a group, you can at least, come up to a decision. And then what we tend to say is 2 things, try and not make the decision on the same day, but give everybody, time to process, give somebody, a day, 2 days to think about it. And then secondly, don't look for whether or not somebody is going to be a good fit. Assess whether somebody is lacking what is needed, right? Because if somebody is clearly lacking X and they have all the other things, then probably they're not going to work out. So, try and look at the downside. What is the downside if this particular person were to be a part of our team? Why would we fire this particular person in 3 to 6 months? And then kind of reverse engineer that. Otherwise, you might still get swayed, and there's always going to be hierarchical status elements within a group. If the hiring manager, who's also the team boss, has a particular affinity for somebody else, he or she might always still get swayed. So again, you're trying to make it as objective as possible. And one way you can do that is by at least fostering a healthy discussion amongst the team, right? If everybody's part of that and everybody has a little bit of insight into what elements are good and bad, you can come up with a pretty good process that is not as time consuming as it sounds, because what you're basically doing is you're creating a system and you rotate the members of the team in that particular system. But it's definitely good to have the entire team be a part of it.
Yeah, thanks. That's useful. I'm actually taking notes as we talk, so I'll stick these up on Slack after I'm done.
Awesome.
Thanks.
That would be really good, Roger. Marian, Roger, did you have another one? We rotated.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. 3, but 2 are combined. The idea of assessments, or rather to put applicants through assessments, is basically stemming from a fear of you. It's something I heard you mention as well. People say that they have, for example, proficient in French, but they've only done 2 years at 16. would redress the balance, because I have been deluded by companies. Not that they set out to delude me, but the interviewing process and the description, so to speak, were such that they were looking for traits and things for what they planned to be doing in X years. And the current situation was about 180 degrees the other way around. So what could you, or could you even envision redressing the imbalance that there is in doing these assessments? Would a company be willing to do an assessment the other way around?
It's a good question, and again, most companies are actually actively, being assessed by themselves, by things like the Equal Opportunity Office in the U.S., and then there's plenty of bodies within, government bodies and in both the EU that always check for whether or not the right things are being done in the right way possible. Now, in terms of your specific experience where a company had a description in the job which was not the one that actually was what they were hiring for, that is unfortunately something that is still going to happen. It still happens because companies not always correctly understand what they're looking for. Companies not always correctly communicate that, and you are right to be tough on them. And there is this great platform these days, it's called Glassdoor,
Yeah.
in which which applicants can share these things, and there is a checks and balances there. There is a currency, a social currency, a social price to pay when the company is participating in these types of behaviors. So in that sense, I don't know how it was in the past, because I've not been around, for 50 or 60 years. I know since I've worked in HR that most of the companies that we work with, barring one or two, that are trying to cut corners, most companies are genuinely looking to improve and genuinely are looking to get the applicants to feel like they are wanted, and they want to have them there from the first step. Do they always execute that in the best way possible? No. That's just unfortunately the reality of learning from mistakes. You have to make them before you can learn from them. However, would I say that I've found that companies, consciously set out to, lie and cheat to applicants?
No, I
Then,
wasn't saying that.
and I'm not trying to put words in you, I'm just trying to paint a broader picture. I would say most companies are very much aware of their reputation. It takes one bad review that catches up on Glassdoor, and it's going to go viral. It's up to on Twitter, and as a company, you're faced with the cost of doing wrong, malignantly and consciously, is so high that most companies, if they make mistakes, they are willing to admit to them. And again, in the US, we're seeing, right, this is a really great example. Companies are, when they have bad practices, they get fined. They get fined millions of dollars. Now you can say, oh, that's just, that's a bucket, it's a drop in the bucket for these companies, but it's still a signal, right? Somebody is watching, and you as an applicant, as a citizen, have more ways to have your voice heard and actually check and make sure that these companies do the right thing. So I would say, it's unfortunate that you went through that experience. I don't know what the company's intentions were. I will say that in general, companies right now are aware of the power of an individual and are trying to make it as fair and possible for all involved.
It wasn't as bad as it may have sounded. It's just that they doesn't really matter. They were just describing what they were working towards rather than their current situation. That's all. All it did was paint a rosier picture than the current situation was. And that led to some disappointment, but other than that, no.
Wait, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just, I have to go, but I don't want to stop the conversation because I feel like this is it's really great that it's so active.
Do you want me to join as co-host?
Can I switch the host and can you stop the recording when it's done? Is that possible?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I really don't know.
Just as a technical point, I have a hard deadline in 4 minutes.
In that case, let's just wrap it up.
Okay, so there's one last question that you can answer in 3 minutes.
Let's call each other. Roger, you can say whether you have an more interesting question. My question would have been, what other ways are you considering to keep the blind audition benefits without getting people to put in a considerable amount of effort up front? I'm thinking audio interviews. I'm thinking chat interviews and that kind of thing. Are you even considering something like that?
Oh, we're always exploring new ways of enhancing the interview process. So yes, audio is there, chat is there. We definitely look at that. However, I will say that a key component of assessing is always going to be, for us at least, to look at your skill set and how can we check for your skill set. That's always going to be a part of our way of assessing it. Somebody else might do it differently. We will always keep that as a core.
I missed, what did you say was your way? I'm sorry, there was a lot of background.
So the core for us is always going to be looking at somebody's skills and assessing that. So we will enhance it with audio assessments, or you have audio and all those things, barring for bias, because again an accent can give an indication. However, we feel that assessing somebody's abilities is an objective way of doing it properly, and balancing it between asking from the applicant and giving back is key.
Is this a written assessment? Because I missed the beginning.
So it can be a written assessment. It can be an actual building out an actual prototype of something, depending on the type of role that the company is looking to hire for.
Okay.
Right.
Roger, you are my closing question.
Well, you can pick between these two, which is either one, any suggestions for helping hiring managers become aware of their own unconscious bias, or anything specific for the tech industry, which is quite white male dominated?
So I think both are valid. So let me try and quickly assess both questions. First question, being aware of your own biases. One, it's good. Two, it's quite impractical as well, because again, being aware of it and being aware of it in the moment that you need to execute something that is unconscious in a conscious fashion, it requires a lot of years and training. Daniel Kahneman, somebody who's been studying biases for the last, I would say, 30 years of his professional life, when asked the question, are you better at managing your own biases, he said, I am no better now than I was when I started my actual work. So it's something that is, again, it's a more, there are more systemic ways of managing bias that don't always put the onus on the individual. It's good to know about it, but it's very difficult to self-medicate, if I can use that terminology, right? You're gonna need assistance from other elements within your environment to make you more objective. For the tech industry, any advice? Yes, of course. However, most of the advice is already been given, right? I mean, look at your pipeline. Start at an earlier age and get women involved. Get girls to understand that STEM is not a male-dominated thing. Make your assessments better. Pay the same price. Pay the same salary to everybody. All those things. Again, there is a lot of things that already been said. There's a lot of things that already been done. The issue here is that it's you're talking about an industry that needs to improve, right? There's examples of companies that are doing really well. A company called ThoughtWorks, if you want to Google them, they are excelling at getting women in their particular company, whereas other companies are doing poorly. So on a whole, I would say the tech industry has a lot of work still to do. It should also keep doing the right things, because when you're talking about systemic issues that need to be changed, it's oftentimes that you need some catalyst to actually get things to move in the right direction. And with large organizations such as Google and Facebook, it takes some time. But again, having spoken to many people in the tech industry, there is a serious commitment there. People are in it for the long haul, and they are self-aware, right? They know that they have to do better. They know that they are going to make mistakes. They know that they need to increase their awareness and their efforts. And sometimes it means taking drastic measures, right? I mean, the CEO of Uber got replaced in large part because of the way that the company culture had grown and the way that they were doing things around hiring and employee retention. So there is a price that's more and more being paid for not doing the right thing, and that I can only encourage. And then I would say, what, the last thing I want to put there is throw a bit more money at it, because companies, talent is the number one thing if you read all their platforms, all their statements. But when you look at where the investment is going, it's going into software, it's going into hardware, it's going into everything. And I'm not saying that you need to treat it like it's the end all and be all, though it is. However, treat it with more respect and dignity, in terms of finance, because that will just make HR, be a little bit more able to do the things that they need to do, because the knowledge is there, the willingness is there, but sometimes, or a lot of times, there are serious constraints in terms of what they are actually able to do.
Well, on that note, Petar, really, thank you so much. You went full steam for an hour. I mean, that was really impressive.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the questions, Jane, Marianne, Roger. And
thank you.
Yeah.
We'll be checking out the site.
If better people who want to find you, what's the website? Gap Jumpers.
.me, and yeah, that's where they can find us. They want to get in touch, shoot me an email. No problem at all, and I'm happy to answer anybody's questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been great. We'll post this for everyone. This is for members only, so enjoy for all of our Happy Melly members.
Thank you for having me, and have a great rest of the day.